Today I want to talk about self-typing, not the usual discussion that I have about how important it is, but more about how I did mine and how I approached all the different facets of theory and all the different authors and integrated all of them in my self-typing. Because there's so much potential for dissonance between them. And sometimes giving an example of how I went about it is better than simply trying to describe the differences or what to do to arrive at yours. This is something from my experience professionally. I've worked as a teacher. I worked for a couple of years as a teacher, and even more relevantly, I think I worked a few years as a counselor. And it's called peer support, which is a very important part of mental health field and professions. I worked on a team with therapists, psychiatrists, social workers, and substance abuse counselors to help clients with all of their needs, everything from housing to their medications to emotional support to driving places. And one big aspect of that was something I was taught, that I was trained to do, was to share my own recovery story of what it's like to live with a diagnosis, what it's like to be on medications and have to find a job and have to get through, a quote unquote normal, presumably normal world, being sort of an abnormal person and having some mental health issues. So sharing my story was one of the most important parts, because that helped to give people an example and show them what it can look like. So for people that they haven't typed themselves and they haven't sorted out the wings, the trifix, the stacking, all these elements, it can be beneficial to hear somebody explain how they did it for their own lives. Okay, so, and as a secondary reason behind this is to communicate with people so that they can understand me. Because I have friends on here and I think they're curious about me and are curious about some of the logic I use, especially after witnessing and engaging in discussions or whatever with me over the years about self-typing. And the third reason is to clear up some misconceptions that people seem to have about how I see the Enneagram types and how I see some of the theoretical elements or fundamentals from people. Of course, like to bash Naranjo, but it would be anything that they don't like, that they see as a weakness, that they're going to try to attack. However, let's take a look at the fact that people say, well, subtypes and countertypes and all of this is not important, or it's ridiculous. And I don't think that it's necessary to be extremely partisan about that. I think that, honestly, in the Enneagram community, it's a small community. It doesn't need to break down into factions and parties and polarities at all. There's no need for it. It will do that. It's prone to doing that, as any group is. But it shouldn't, in the sense of there being one cohesive vision. It's literally the same exact shape and form, and if you break down beneath the hood, what's going on. They're the same types across authors. I think people are becoming too attached to superficial definitions, and the Enneagram is something a little bit more abstract. So people often talk past each other and think somebody means one thing when they mean another. They read into what they're saying and what's being described. Okay, so, for me personally, in looking at, people trying to reconcile stackings versus subtypes, for me personally, it made sense that I would be a counter type 8 because I didn't identify myself as an 8 from the get-go using Riso and Hudson. And, it wasn't until I really read some other authors that I started to think that. And I think it probably was by the time I got to Naranjo, because that's about as deep as people would go in those days. They didn't even have each other. So his work wasn't even published until the last few years. So in looking at different authors, I started to consider different types for myself. And early on, I can tell you that I was motivated by, the simple fact that in R&H, the 5 was, showcased as a genius that I wanted. Unconsciously or not, consciously or not, I wanted to be the smartest. And there was not understanding the Enneagram completely and going by this kind of stereotype that 5 is the only type that has genius mentioned with its name. Having these intellectual ambitions myself, I thought, sure, that could be me, right? If that's where the real geniuses are. It was kind of an unconscious push towards it. So later on, once I studied subtypes and instincts in more depth and stackings and everything, it made sense that the social instinct would work for me. Regardless of type, that started to make sense. And then I knew I was an 8 by that point. I'd already narrowed it down. I first thought I was a self-pres 8, and then I thought I was sexual 8. First I thought I was self-pres because all of the physical stuff, the fact that I'm a big eater, drinker, big on physical activity, that I have huge appetites and the like, and I'm in that, feel like I'm in that space, which really is more just core 8 stuff. Because if you look at my health records and the way things kind of drift off with me, that if I don't pay attention, suddenly I've gained weight, I have an injury, my teeth are rotting, I'm addicted to drugs, I'm missing doctor appointments. It's what happens when I don't pay attention to it. My bank account is, in debt, and so that all is very much more SP last, that I just don't focus on it. The more, it's not everything, it's just some things that end up, being paid attention to. And then with sexual, I thought I was a sexual because I'm so big on relationships and sex and creativity, and I can be emotional, and my relationships have really been everything to me, and my sexual relationships, intimate relationships, not friendships. Friendships I thought are kind of a dime a dozen. You hold on to them if you can, but you can also make new friends. They're not exclusive the way boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife is. Okay, but then I went to see how this is something that is a little bit more, it's not neglected, but it can go underground more easily. With the sexual 8s, once I started comparing myself to sexual 8s, I found something much more, much more pronounced in the sexual relationships. Often, generally, in my experience, they were more sexually promiscuous. They were, in some ways, not as picky. It was more kind of all-encompassing, and there was more facility there in finding partners. And the relationships were often characterized by infidelity, because this is a lust, again, in the sexual space. Likewise, with the self-preservation 8s, I found somebody who was more lustful about their survival and getting what they needed, and it carried over into physical practicality and proficiencies and just sort of being on top of everything. And I wasn't seeing that in myself. And with the sexual space, I was seeing a possessiveness, but the social eight is also described as possessive, and eights in general they're possessive. This is part of the way they operate as maintaining power and control. But with the sexual, they were described as an obvious eight, so that was an exception I had to look the other way on to be asexual. Not all the pieces were there, so this was how I did my work logically to get to the place that I'm at. And the sexuals as well were more commanding overall in terms of situations, that they were a little bit better at taking charge because they have kind of alpha, male, female, dominant biases, which is a little bit hard to describe, but it was something I found that it was more of an obvious dominant type of person in a relationship setting, not necessarily in a group setting. In the group setting, often the social has a status and a role that defines leadership, but just in interpersonal relationships and kind of having that charisma and having that center of gravity and that energetic center. Okay, so that ruled out those two. There are parts that ruled those out. And then the sexual, once I looked at this, I looked at how the social eight was defined as arising. I looked at the origins for all of them in youth, and the way Naranjo describes it in the social eight is who becomes violent in defending the mother against the father. And when I was a kid, my dad left when I was about 3, left my mom, and she was depressed, and the logic there is that there's some feeling of abuse and oppression from the father, and then the social eight feels the need to kind of fill that missing role or to combat against that patriarchal abuse, to be the good father or to be the good power. And so then it becomes violence for injustice and solidarity. And I always sympathized with my mom and thought it was hard that she was left behind like that. I know she suffered depression, and he then teamed up with my stepmom, so it was natural for me then to kind of side with my mom. And so there's an origin story there about how that came about, and that's where the social eight's lustfulness comes from. Their justification for it is because there was an imbalance of power there, and they weren't quite alone in that. It was engendered from some other place, that they were siding with somebody or a cause. And I found that it showed up again in school, with friendships. Often we would have rivalries with other friends groups. I went to a bilingual school, and there was a lot of rivalry between the Hispanic kids and the Caucasian Anglo kids. And I did my best to be friends with people on both sides, but I can remember some rivalries there. And for a while, all my friends were, Anglo kids. And then even within that, you hear the social eight described as somebody who develops vendettas. So even within those friends groups, then there were rivalries where I would lash out at one person and sing one person out. And over time, an 8 is an 8. The social 8 is not necessarily the good 8. It's relatively speaking. And I was rejected from friends. The people didn't like what I was doing, and so the potential to be, a bad person or whatever is very well intact, and to be a bully and to be aggressive. But there also were very close friendships, close bonds that I developed with friends, best friends, and we would talk about our lives and our life plans and goals, and there was much more of a full connection there. Okay, so it made sense once I put it together. I had romantic longings and sexual, crushes and lust and all this. It was all there. It was there, but my behavior didn't lend itself as well to success in those facets. I ate too much, and I was overweight, and I kind of self-sabotaged. I ended up feeling self-conscious, and the social subtypes often are more self-conscious because they think a little bit more about their status, comparing themselves to others in the hierarchy. So when I really sat down and looked at it, that was the one that made the most sense. And that was, I think, a couple of years ago now, or something like that, a year and a half ago. I don't know exactly how long ago, when after thinking it was self-pres and then it was sexual, I really thought that social was the type to fit. And then I swung back and went back to sexual because my relationship, that I was in a marriage, and I was very into that, very focused on that. So I thought surely it should be sexual, but I let it go for the reasons that I've mentioned. And then the other thing to help was to look at the theory behind how the instincts develop. In childhood, there's a disturbance in one of three areas that affects the instinct, how it develops. In the self-preservation, it's in the space of health and a disturbance to the environment. There's something unsafe. I did have some physical illness and so on when I was very young, and as an infant, and I was a premature child, and I think that contributed to me developing just the core fixation, something with the mother relationship, and being birthed too soon and struggling and being weak and frail and left at the hospital. I thought that was more core 8 stuff. But with the instincts, it talks about how the sense of belonging was impacted. And again, a divorce when I was 3, this affected my sense of fitting in. There was a broken home. There was back and forth between the two households. And then it also showed up in school with social groups that there were different races and there's division. So I was able to see that ultimately, how that worked. The other option was a sexual that is, defined by disturbance in the relationship with one or both of the parents. There's something about the relationship that's really thrown off kilter. And there wasn't as much of that with me. I think maybe something with my dad, as I mentioned, or with my mom, there was an imbalance, but all in all, I was able to go with social because go one step further and break down how the social instinct is actually defined. And this can be done by going back to Gurdjieff, that he talks about the lower centers, and there are 3 lower centers, and these really were the instincts. These were an early version of what led to the self-pres, social, and sexual instincts. These were a way of understanding how they operate. Of course, they're not precisely that, because they're not describing the exact purposes. The purpose is different, but the way they operate is in analogy with this. And the self-preservation is something very reflexive. These were autonomic processes in the body, stuff that you can't help. And they become very habitual. And you can see this showing up in the self-preservation instinct, that the self-preservation, these are survival instincts. These are something that's more deeply hardwired into us, and they tend to be a bit more common than the others. They're more sometimes more action oriented, but they specifically focus on sensory reality and basic survival mechanics that were built into our very existence. And so there's something more automatic, and these were described as slower moving. I thought moving is a little bit deceptive. It's more like slower. I mean, I think in the grand scheme they are a little bit slower moving. I think the self-preservation types are a little bit less reactive. They think things through more and they have more stability about them. And that doesn't mean that they're slow. They necessarily are slow. They're still reflexive, but they have a pacing to them that is consistent somehow. I think that the speed of these centers can be deceptive. I wouldn't go just by that, but those are there as theoretical facts. Okay, and then the social was the motor center, which is anything learned. This is a step up on speed. It can be, once learned, it can be sped up, and it's more moderate in its speed, but this is all types of learned behaviors, which makes sense because they come from society. Okay, whereas the reflexes come from the self and from within. They're totally innate. They're autonomic. The social comes from without. It's acquired skills, language, mannerisms, learned behavior, just about anything abstractly within that. And then in the social instinct, you can see that these acclimate us and accustom us to different cultures. If we have a social instinct that operates at a high frequency, then we can adapt to a group, we can learn about what's expected, we can fit in, or we can rebel against it, we can take it in more, and we can develop more social relationships too by using socially constructed methodologies, devices, friendships, roles, statuses. All of that comes from the social instinct. So it's fairly broad, but on a basic level, Gurdjieff defined it as motor center, which is comparable to motor, playing the piano or writing. These are taught to us. And then finally, there's a sexual. And sexual is, the sex center, which is sex, genitals, where we have sex, all of that, where we get turned on. And it's not just about sexuality. It's the fastest moving, but it's also about getting turned on, how we move from an unaroused state to a state of arousal. Okay, and this is kind of the way the sexual instinct operates, is that it gets fired up quickly, and it can be all or nothing. It seeks something, right? It resonates with something, it reacts with something, it gets turned on by an object or a person or whatever, and then it wants to interact with it and to find sexual gratification. It is also a procreative impulse. There's the desire, the impulse to have offspring, right? It has an output, it has a clear output. And that's just on an instinctual level. So the sexual instinct also operates as another fairly intuitive thing. So with those as a background, you can also then plug them into later theory and see how it comes together. So, the self-preservation makes sense that it has to do with the body, how I'm doing, what my state is. It can be independence, it can be dependence, it can be whatever is needed to take care of that. And it can be too much, it can be too little, it can be reacting to it all the time. It's generally something that people take care of somewhat automatically, and it doesn't need to be justified for self-preservation. First, taking care of those needs is just second nature. And then the social instinct, the social first, often finds themselves reacting more to cultures, to intellectual traditions, all those learned skills and those more abstract systems and ideas in general are basically socially constructed, come from the social instinct, a lot of ideas. So you can see that the social firsts tend to gravitate towards building relationships and friendships, and sometimes climbing the social ladder, or finding their place within a hierarchy, or developing a role as a leader, or whatever. Putting a name to what they're seeing is kind of a rationalizing instinct, and is often somewhat more extroverted. These can be talkative, friendly, engaging people. And then the sexual instinct shows up in sexual relationships, in attraction, and the social instinct often is built on a lot of reciprocity in the way these relationships function. If I form a friendship or a connection with somebody, I feel that there's a reciprocity there. There are defined roles, right? That if you're friends, then you're supposed to be kind of egalitarian friends. If you're student and teacher, then you each have your function. If you are mother and child, same thing. Husband and wife, same thing. It's very kind of orderly, relatively speaking, and there's often a reciprocity and an expectation. Whereas with the sexual, there are two basic polarities of masculine and feminine, but that's kind of it. There's a very affective quality to it that has to do with reacting to each other. So the relationships are not as rational. It's more of an irrational instinct. There's erotic attraction, and erotic dynamics are very irrational. So the relationships that the sexual firsts have, not only characterized by more sexuality in terms of sexual partners or whatever, in their other relationships, it's often based more on one state reacting to another and sending out a signal that the other person then responds to or picks up on. It's the other kind of facet of relating. Next to the social, the self-preservations, they also have a way of relating to people, but it's largely to do with establishing, respecting, and enjoying boundaries together, and fostering mutual health, and kind of establishing ourselves as individuals that we can share and we can get along, and it ends up being domesticated, and they have a way of relating too, but it's more automatic that, hey, I was making some food, would you like some as well? It kind of naturally starts with the self and extends to the others. They kind of start with number one, and then they can be very caregiving, nurturing, loving people. It's not all selfish behavior, and they have a preferred way of relating to people in relationships. There's often a bigger focus on comfort and sensuality as well, but all three of the instincts have a preferred relationship style, and there are different names for the stackings. The stackings then came out of all this. It wasn't just the subtypes. So for myself, I had to look at stackings, and the social over sexual is sort of a best friend. Sometimes called the best friend stacking, and I always had kind of one or two best friends or core friendship groups. And with intimates, that became the best friend all the time. So then you can see that is heavily loaded up with sexual charge, and those became kind of the be all end all for me. That once there was betrayal in those and I was left with nothing, I became suicidally depressed. I was in a horrible way. Everything came crashing down for me, because if those are the most important relationship in your life, once that's gone, you feel that you've really lost something and you don't know what to do. Especially if you can't get it back. There's no way. You feel helpless, horrible. So social over sexual came to make sense for me, given all of the dynamics I mentioned. And it's also, was considered a social butterfly stacking as one of the SP lasts. And when I'm in a group